On the 11th of July 1578, Queen Elizabeth I of England set out from her palace at Greenwich on the latest of what had become a regular summer progress, out of London and into another part of her realm.
Elizabeth wasn't the first English monarch to make such journeys out of the capital, but she embraced the concept wholeheartedly.
The Queen recognised that these annual progresses contributed to the stability and popularity of the monarchy, as well as being a major PR exercise.
It was rather surprising that up until now the Queen had not made a progress to Norwich. It was, after all, the second largest city in the country, with about 16,000 inhabitants. However, the time now seemed right to travel through East Anglia. First, like all other progresses, it was an opportunity to show off the Queen and her court in all their splendour. Secondly, the region still had its fair share of recusant Catholics, and this visit provided an opportunity to hunt them out.
At a time when there was no social media, television, or even newspapers, the only way the Queen could be seen by her subjects was if she appeared to them in person. This meant visiting towns and cities in the important parts of her realm and making herself visible to her people.
Queen Elizabeth seems to have enjoyed these visits, which proved very successful. According to the Spanish ambassador writing in 1568,
She was received everywhere with great acclamation and signs of joy, as is customary in this country, whereat she was exceedingly pleased.
Another account says that she
Draws the hearts of the people after her, wheresoever she travels.
the Scottish diplomat Sir James Melville, an emissary to the court of Queen Elizabeth I, records in his memoirs,
My Lord Hunsdon drew me up to a quiet gallery where I might hear the Queen play upon the virginals. I entered within the chamber and stood a pretty space, hearing her play excellently well. But she left off and came forward, seeming to strike me with her hand, alleging she was not used to play before men, but only when she was solitary, to shun melancholy.
music and dancing were very important to the Queen. She played various instruments and practised dance daily. The virginals was a particular favourite of Elizabeth's, and this keyboard instrument is even said by some to have been named for the Virgin Queen.
Elizabeth also played the lute, an instrument that had gained enormous popularity right across Europe, especially among the upper echelons of society.
On New Year's Day, 1578, a courtier, Ambrose Lupo, presented Her Majesty with a box of lute strings. Gut strings were very expensive, and so this must have proved a very welcome gift.
With all the elaborate and extensive preparations in place, Queen Elizabeth began a journey that was to culminate with a stay in the city of Norwich.
The first stage of Elizabeth's 1578 progress charted a well-worn path through Essex. Both she and her court were familiar with this part of the country.
The Queen and her retinue rode on horseback, but they were preceded or accompanied by between 200 and 300 horse-drawn carts, which carried everything necessary to establish the Queen's personal chambers and her court.
Her Majesty and the Privy Council formed the government, and so it was necessary to continue state business on the move. Many of the Privy Councillors, including the Lord Treasurer, the Lord Chamberlain, and the Vice-Chamberlain, were almost constantly at Elizabeth's side during the progress.
An elaborate network of couriers was established across the eastern counties so as to ensure that the Queen and her ministers were able to dispatch and receive letters without delay. Much important business, both domestic and foreign, was conducted over that summer.
Although the overnight stops along the route of Elizabeth's progress would have been decided some months beforehand, the more detailed arrangements, such as where her entourage was to stay, were worked out much nearer the time.
A small advance party comprising a few key court officials travelled some days ahead of the main party. They worked to recreate, as near as was possible, the ideal layout of the Queen's rooms. Her first overnight stop was easy, as it was in one of her own palaces in Havering.
Privy councillors and other important officials were found lodgings in nearby manors and towns, with the others staying wherever was possible, more often than not in less than ideal conditions. But for the Queen's stay at Havering, everything was just as it was at home, including the fine array of clothes she needed for her various functions, and the crockery and cutlery used by her and her immediate circle.
Since Queen Elizabeth ensured that she had all her home comforts around her, we can assume that she also brought her musical instruments.
Elizabeth's final overnight stay in Essex was at Audley End. Not at the house that stands today, which is Jacobean, but at an earlier manor house on the estate.
This was the property of the teenage Thomas Howard. Thomas's father, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, had been executed just a year after the Queen's previous visit to the house in 1571, when he was already under house arrest for conspiring against the monarch with Mary, Queen of Scots.
Elizabeth stayed at Audley End for nearly a week, during which time she received a delegation from the University of Cambridge. The academics presented Her Majesty with a New Testament in Greek, bound in red velvet and lined with gold. Other gifts included a pair of perfumed, embroidered and gilded gloves. Gaining an audience with the Queen was clearly a costly business. The university also had to fork out expenses for the various entertainments. They paid a total of 18 shillings to the Queen's trumpeters and gave 2 shillings and 6 to other musicians who accompanied a play.
The Queen was joined at Audley End by her cousin Henry Carey. Henry, the 1st Earl of Hunsdon, was Master of the Queen's Hawks, a salaried position earning the princely sum of £40 a year. Queen Elizabeth also gifted him and his wife the manor of Hunsdon, where they lived in a house built by Henry VIII.
So far, the Queen had travelled through part of the country with which she was familiar, but her crossing into Suffolk represented a departure from the known into the unknown.
With a few notable exceptions, she was to stay in more modest accommodation, honouring chosen hosts with her presence, whilst at the same time presenting a huge logistical and monetary burden on these gentlemen.
At this point in the progress, we can turn to an account by Thomas Churchyard. Churchyard accompanied the royal party and documented Elizabeth's travels, in particular her reception in the counties and towns she visited. This gives us an insight into the sights and sounds of this royal spectacular. He writes,
For, as I heard, there were 200 young gentlemen, clad all in white velvet, and 300 of the graver sort, apparelled in black velvet coats and fair chains, all ready at one instant and place, with 1,500 serving men, more on horseback, well and bravely mounted, in good order, ready to receive the Queen's Highness into Suffolk, which surely was a comely troop and a noble sight to behold. But before Her Highness passed to Norfolk, there was in Suffolk such sumptuous feasting and banquets as seldom in any part of the world has been seen before.
It is rather surprising that during her progress, the Queen not only stayed with prominent Protestant families, but also some Catholics. She was clearly not too fussed when it came to her comfort.
In Suffolk, she enjoyed hospitality from long-established wealthy landowners such as Thomas Barnardiston in Keddington, George Colt of Cavendish, and Sir William Drury at Lawshall Hall. The Queen's route through Suffolk was designed not only to take advantage of the best hospitality on offer, but also to pass through as many villages as possible. The progress was, after all, about visibility to the people.
Elizabeth stayed 3 nights at the magnificent Melford Hall, the home of Sir William Cordell, the Queen's Master of the Rolls. According to Thomas Churchyard, Cordell set the standard for Suffolk hospitality during the progress, entertaining members of her court, presenting gifts, and putting on entertainments.
Amidst all this rejoicing, state business had to continue. The 8 members of the Privy Council met twice during the stay, and Elizabeth gave 2 audiences, to a French delegation and to the Scottish ambassador.
Despite the obvious excitement at the Queen's visit to the region, it is a shame that very few comments exist in local records of the time.
However, one rare surviving example is to be found in the parish register of Lawshall, alongside the entries of baptisms, marriages and burials for 1578. It sums up the mood of the local people and reads:
It is to be remembered that the Queen's Highness in her progress, riding from Melford to Bury, 5th of August, the 20th year of the Queen's reign, in the aforesaid year of our Lord, dined at Lawshall Hall, to the great rejoicing of the said parish and the country thereabouts.
The royal party stayed in Bury St Edmunds for 4 days. The Queen at the home of Thomas Baby, created from the old Abbey buildings, and her closest advisors in a house nearby.
The authorities had patched up 2 of the town gates to the west and to the north for the occasion. They wanted to show Bury at its very best for its royal visitor and her entourage.
An entry in the St James's Parish Register for burials in 1578 contains this rather short mention of the monarch's visit.
At this time, the Queen's Majesty at Bury.
Of more interest, perhaps, is a burial entry on the 8th of August, during the royal visit, for a plague victim called William West. A courtier, maybe. His burial is followed less than a month later by a long list of others who perished after contracting the dreaded plague.
It has been noted that other towns on and near the route of the summer's progress also suffered significant losses due to the plague in the weeks and months following the royal visit. It is perhaps not surprising that they brought the disease from the capital to East Anglia, given the sheer size of the Queen's entourage.
During her stay in Bury, the Queen visited the manor house of Sir William Drury at Horsted, which had recently been rebuilt.
After hunting in her host's deer park, Queen Elizabeth was wined and dined with what Thomas Churchyard described as a costly and delicate dinner, no doubt accompanied by music and dancing.
Before leaving Suffolk, Elizabeth stayed in the house of Edward Rookwood of Euston, a controversial choice given that he belonged to a family of Catholics. So why choose Euston? Well, simply because there was a dearth of other suitable overnight stops in the area. The Queen's party departed for Norfolk after just 2 nights.
Once again, we return to Churchyard's account of the progress to describe Queen Elizabeth's arrival into Norfolk, told with his usual flowery language.
The Norfolk gentlemen, hearing how dutifully their neighbours had received the prince, prepared in like sort to show themselves dutiful, and so in most gallantest manner assembled and set forward with 2500 horsemen, whereof as some affirm, were 600 gentlemen, so bravely attired and mounted, as indeed was worthy the noting, which goodly company waited on their sheriff a long season. But in good sooth, as I have heard credibly spoken, the banquets and feasts began here afresh, and all kind of triumphs that might be devised were put in practice and proof.
On her way to Norwich, the Queen stayed overnight in 2 locations. The first at Kenninghall Place, which had earlier in the century been the residence of the Dukes of Norfolk, and in Bracken Ash.
At Kenninghall, the Earl of Surrey put on what was described as a great entertainment.
Not only were the monarch's hosts expected to spare no expense towards keeping Elizabeth and her court fed and watered, they also had to keep her entertained with elaborate plays. Dance played a prominent part in such diversions, and since the Queen was a keen dancer, she may well have joined in. Even into her mid-50s, Queen Elizabeth would regularly practice her dancing. One of her gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, John Stanhope, reported that
6 or 7 galliards in a morning, besides music and singing, is her ordinary exercise.
Other dances of the period included a more sprightly dance called the Coranto. Another of Elizabeth's favourites was called the Volta, which it is said she danced with the Earl of Essex. Detailed instructions as to how to dance the Volta were set out by Arbo.
The man lets go of his partner's hand and takes hold of her below her busk with one hand and places the other hand on her back above the far hip.
As you can see, this was a rather risque and controversial dance for the time.
The culmination of the Queen's East Anglian progress was her visit to Norwich. In 1578, it was the second city in the kingdom in terms of both size and importance.
The mayor had been alerted to the impending visit in June,
and had immediately set about making preparations for the royal visitor.
Orders were sent out to tidy the approaches through the many city gates. St. Stephen's Gate was given special attention, with a gravelled approach, along with St. Giles Gate, which was widened. The wall at St. John's Church was taken down, the road improved, and then the wall was re-erected.
The market cross was painted. The public pillory and cage were removed from the marketplace to a more distant location, ensuring miscreants did not escape punishment just because of the royal visit.
Much is known about the Queen's visit to Norwich. Soon after the Progress, Bernard Garter published an extraordinarily detailed blow-by-blow account of her 6-night stay. Garter also seems to have stage-managed some of the events, as well as writing some of the speeches made by the mayor and other dignitaries.
After a lavish reception with all the pomp and ceremony at Harford Bridge, the procession entered the city at St. Stephen's Gate, where the Queen was met with music played by 5 of the Norwich Waits.
Most of the larger or more important towns and cities had their own waits. This was a band of musicians employed by the mayor and city elders to provide music on important civic occasions. They wore colourful uniforms along with silver gilt chains to denote their office. These waits played a number of different instruments and were expected to sing. For outdoor occasions, they used the louder shawms and sackbuts.
Thomas Churchyard had arrived in Norwich 3 weeks ahead of the Queen's party. He was responsible for organising the various entertainments for Elizabeth. This involved finding suppliers and workmen, recruiting and training the cast, organising costume and props, supervising the music and musicians, and stage managing the show.
As the royal procession toured the city, they were greeted with music, speeches and entertainments along the way.
Inevitably, the cost to the Norwich authorities of putting on all these events mounted up. Among the expenses listed in the borough records are 53 shillings and 4 pence given to the trumpeters. The various viol players were paid 20 shillings, as were the cornet players.
Not all of Churchyard's planned entertainments in the city of Norwich were a success. One event saw the participants waiting 3 hours for Queen Elizabeth to arrive. They gave up when it got dark and went home disappointed.
On another occasion, the show was interrupted by a violent thunderstorm, leaving the actors to shelter under a bridge.
The Royal Assembly entered the recently refurbished cathedral precinct through the Erpingham Gate. There, Her Majesty found a great throne, the canopy stiffened with buckram and covered and hung with crimson velvet, satin and silk. It was decorated with crimson silk lace and a dozen silk buttons.
That evening, Elizabeth, her court, dignitaries and the mayor attended a service in Norwich Cathedral. The magnificent building had been spruced up in advance of the visit.
The music for the service attended by the monarch came from a new organ installed for the occasion. The choir and lay clerks, or singing men, included the composer Osbert Parsley. His memorial tablet in the cathedral records that he worked in the building for 50 years. Parsley was paid 6 shillings and 8 pence for the songs composed by him specially for the Queen's visit. Unfortunately, as in Bury, it appears that the royal party left the plague in Norwich when they departed.
At St Peter Mancroft, the parish register records that 246 people were buried in 1579, as opposed to an average yearly figure of just 25 or so.
In fact, in the following few months, Norwich suffered a very serious outbreak of plague, which lasted well into the next year. Nearly 5,000 people died, and perhaps with good reason, the infection was blamed on the royal progress.
Having got the larger spectacles of the summer progress out of the way, the serious business of examining those remaining pockets of Catholic resistance in the region got underway.
These hearings, which had begun in Norwich, continued in various stopovers on the royal party's journey through the eastern counties back to London.
The most notable among those examined included Sir Henry Bedingfield of Oxborough Hall and Edward Rookwood, who had been the Queen's host earlier in her progress at Euston. Many of those who were examined eventually conformed to the Protestant faith, although others didn't, including Rookwood and Humphrey Bedingfield, Sir Henry's younger brother, both spending time in Norwich Prison.
Elizabeth's first overnight stop after her departure from Norwich was at Kimberley, at which Thomas Churchyard reported that the Queen
was well received and nobly entertained.
From there, she travelled on just a few miles to Woodrising, where she stayed a further 2 nights.
Surviving documents give us an insight into the huge logistical exercise involved in ensuring that Queen Elizabeth's party had enough to eat and that her court and privy council had adequate supplies in order to carry on business. A farm at the nearby village of Letton sent butter and milk to Woodrising, and the manor of Shipdham, a few miles away, contributed wax for document seals costing 8 shillings, wheat at 10 shillings and 8 pence, and oats for the horses costing 4 shillings and 6 pence.
The Shipdham churchwarden's accounts record the payment of 8 pennies worth of bread and drink for the bell ringers who rang for the monarch. This may seem a little odd at first, since the Progress did not visit the village of Shipdham. However, she did go hunting in a nearby deer park, and maybe the churchwardens at Shipdham were playing it safe by ringing the bells.
The Queen's last destination in Norfolk was Thetford. It was another major town which had started its preparations for the royal visit as early as possible. Before the dissolution, Thetford had been an important ecclesiastical centre, but by the time of Elizabeth's progress, the town was governed independently from the Crown.
The surviving Thetford Corporation Assembly Book gives us some fascinating details on what was involved. The mayor's sword of office was renovated, and he was to be given a new scabbard. The town dignitaries were told that they should all appear in decent gowns, and, as in Norwich, roads were repaired, and citizens were told to clean up their houses and the street in front of them.
From Thetford, the royal party headed to Chippenham, just over the border into Cambridgeshire.
En route, Elizabeth stayed for a few nights with Sir Thomas Kitson. The magnificent Hengrave Hall had been built by Kitson's father some 50 years before. At Hengrave and at his house in the City of London, Kitson maintained a cultured and lavish lifestyle. The Queen no doubt enjoyed her stay here. The plush living accommodation must have been more to her liking than some smaller, more modest houses in which she had stayed.
The Kitson family were also well-known patrons of the arts. The house had a music room with an array of instruments.
Sir Thomas and his wife took the business of learning music very seriously. They employed a number of musicians as tutors as well as entertainers. The composer, Edward Johnson, was a member of the household in the 1570s, and later in the century, the madrigalist and lutenist John Wilby lived there. The Queen, being an accomplished lute player herself, may have joined in some music making with her hosts and their musicians.
Privy Council, however, had more serious business to attend to. They met 3 times in as many days, interviewing a group of suspected recusants chosen from a list of 34 names. 9 were sentenced and imprisoned in Ipswich and Bury.
From Chippenham, Queen Elizabeth and her entourage turned southwards to start their long journey back to London, honouring local gentlemen with her presence along the way and leaving them with a hefty entertainment bill. It was also evident to some that the party's progress appeared to have slowed, and rumours were that this was to delay their return because of the plague which was raging in the capital. Indeed, at this stage in the progress, it appears that the planned route was altered to avoid the plague which had been reported in Hertfordshire.
Elizabeth therefore diverted to Horham Hall in Thaxted, to the rather impressive home of Sir John Cutts. Cutts was well known for the extravagance of his lifestyle, being described as
more magnificent than prudent.
Elizabeth's progress was reaching its final stages. In the next 10 days, she stayed overnight in no fewer than 5 different houses in Essex and just over the border into Hertfordshire. Her first stop was at Haddam Hall, the home of Henry Capel.
It was here that the monarch had a second encounter that summer with the poet Gabriel Harvey, the first having been during her stay at Audley End. His attendance would probably have been arranged by his patron Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. However, Dudley was probably not too happy about the advice in one of the poems Harvey presented to the Queen. In it, he suggests that Elizabeth should marry none other than the Earl of Leicester himself.
After her overnight stay at Luxborough Hall in Chigwell, Elizabeth's last dinner of the progress was at Wanstead, the home of her favourite, the Earl of Leicester. He had already been back at Wanstead for several days after having had permission to leave court early, and just 2 days before his royal guest arrived in Wanstead, the Earl was married in secret to Lettice Noyes, the daughter of the Queen's own treasurer of the household. The Queen was totally unaware of this until a full 2 years after her visit.
However, this did not stop the monarch making Lord Leicester's stepson, the Earl of Essex, her favourite later in life.
Can she excuse my wrongs with virtue's cloak? Shall I call her good when she proves unkind? Are those clear fires which vanish into smoke? Must I praise the leaves where no fruit I find? No, where shadows do the body stand. Thou mayst be abused if thy sight be dim. Cold love is like to us written in the sand, or to bubbles which on the water swim. When they thus abuse it still, seeing that she will rightly never, if the consorter come her will, fruitless thy love will be ever. When they thus abuse it still, seeing that she will rightly never, if the consorter come her will, fruitless thy love will be ever.
On her return to London, as on her departure, Queen Elizabeth took a barge across the Thames to Greenwich, where she stayed for only 2 days before moving on to Richmond Palace.
She travelled via South London to once again avoid pockets of the plague. The monarch and her court remained in Richmond until after Christmas.
It was here that she and her close advisers would have been able to reflect on the summer progress and to declare it a great success. First, because Queen Elizabeth had been received in the most populous part of her realm with great acclaim, and secondly, they must have been satisfied that the recusant hearings and subsequent imprisonments sent a strong warning signal to other Catholics in the region.
Elizabeth I of England was undoubtedly one of the great monarchs of the modern age.
Her 1578 visit to East Anglia must have generated a lot of interest and excitement.
We therefore hope that we have captured the essence of that summer spectacular for you, in our words, in pictures, and of course with our music.
Bye, see you soon.